Everyone, good to have you on. I've got a special guest today, Dan Bartlett, who is the Executive Vice President at Walmart of Corporate Affairs. And the reason we've got Dan on today is we're coming up on the 20th year anniversary, 20th year since 9/11, 2001, when the country was attacked. And what some of you may know, but not all of you would know, is that Dan had a very important role in the government at that time and was very, very close to a number of the events that happened on 9/11 and the years following. So Dan, thanks for joining, first of all.
Good to have you. It's good to be with you.
You've been an associate now for 8 years, lived in Northwest Arkansas for that same amount of time. And I want to go back, though, let's start even before 9/11, 2001, but love for everybody to know how you got from a kid in Texas to ending up in the White House altogether. And there's some great stories there I'd like everybody to love to hear.
Well, it wasn't a typical track. I didn't grow up thinking I was going to be in politics. Grew up in the state of Texas, and at that time was a pretty small rural town east of Dallas, Rockwall, Texas, and went to the University of Texas. And my entry into politics really was out of a necessity of finding a job. My parents, my mom told me that if I wanted to not have to come home during the summer break, I had to get a job. And through another buddy of mine, I was able to get a job at the Capitol there in Austin, Texas, the state capitol, and during the legislative session, and started to kind of get the political bug then. And through that, and another friend of mine went to work for a political consultant named Karl Rove, who at the time was not as well-known name, but as he is today in politics, and had the chance. I mean, at that time, George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, was the owner of the Texas Rangers baseball team, was contemplating running for governor of Texas against a wildly popular governor at the time, Ann Richards. And everybody kind of felt it was a fool's errand for him to run against her. I didn't know better to not think through that and maybe picked a different campaign. Turned out to be the right move. Met him very early, and that was, I think, the third or fourth campaign staffer hired right out of. I was finishing college, and it set off a pretty, remarkable run. I was the longest continuous serving staffer to President Bush. I was starting in October of 1993. And leaving the White House in July of 2007. So I went through both his terms as governor of Texas, was able to work on the presidential campaign in 2000, and then served over 7 years in the White House. So it was an extraordinary run.
Yeah, pretty unique. And, when you got to, I don't want to skip over too much because there's a lot in there, but the candidate becomes governor, decides to run for president, and then once he's elected, what happened from there? How did you get from being a staffer in Austin, then into the White House and into the job that you ultimately ended up in before September 11th in 2001?
Yeah, so most of my roles in the governor's office were more policy oriented. As we started to shift to run for president, and I worked on the re-election campaign for governor, and at that time, national pundits and others were already speculating that he was preparing for a run, which we were preparing for that in case he made the decision to do that. And my job started morphing more into the communications role. And as it did that into the presidential campaign, it became almost exclusively more on the communications side. And I was kind of a conduit between the two. And so being on the core campaign staff, typically, historically, those core campaign staffers then make up a core part of the White House staff as well. And so I came in first as deputy communications director under a woman named Karen Hughes. And that was my role for the first year and a half or so. And Karen, for personal reasons, decided earlier than all of us anticipated with her family to move back to Texas and leave the White House a bit early. And I was promoted to communications director much earlier than I thought I would be or deserved, frankly. And I was, I think, the youngest communications director ever in the White House. Like I said, it was surreal. I mean, there were moments early on in there where, if you remember the movie Forrest Gump, and there's always the picture of Tom Hanks in these historic moments that he's the person out of place. I felt like that many times, being in some of these moments that it just didn't feel like I should be there. So And obviously, as that rolled right into 9/11, because it was so early in the presidency, all of us were still really trying to get our own footing and being comfortable with working at the White House and serving the President of the United States. So it was obviously, even going into that, in extraordinary circumstances.
So there's a leadership lesson there that I think a lot of people on our team would want to hear. So when you got the job as communications director, how old were you at the time?
Oh, I had to be 31, 32.
31. Right. So younger than probably everybody in the room in most conversations, and that feeling of, I'm not sure I deserve to be here, should be here. How did you manage that? Because it happens in retail all the time. People get to roles that they weren't expecting at a certain time, and you got to grow into it. And in this situation, you didn't have a lot of time to work into the job.
No, it was, there were some pretty dominant personalities. I mean, I walk into a meeting with Condoleezza Rice, Don Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, Dick Cheney, and I'm sitting there thinking, I have no business first being in this meeting, and much less speaking up in these meetings. But then you just tell yourself there's a reason why you were given this job. There's a reason, and the person that mattered only in that room was the person who ultimately gave me that job, which was President Bush. And over time, he put me through my paces, and he was very much, what I really appreciated, his leadership style. It really was a meritocracy. It was not what you're at, all the different degrees you'd earned, or this or that, or accolades you think you've accomplished. It was, did you know what you're doing? Did you have confidence in what you're saying? And that's what he focused on, was like, he could tell when somebody wasn't sure about themselves. And if you're not confident in what you're recommending, why should he be confident in taking that advice? And so sometimes you hear the old adage, fake it till you make it, and those things. Those I don't think is necessarily true. You don't have to fake it. Be yourself. Be authentic, and trust the fact that there's reasons why people put you in the role in the first place. And the worst thing you can do to not meet their expectations is to be reticent, or to be unwilling to assert yourself, because that's why you're there.
That's right. Be who you are, and you're unique in your own way. Well, let's start with then the morning of 9/11. Probably a normal day. I remember it really well. I don't remember anything up until about 8:45 that morning, but normal day of the week. And what happened, and for all those that are watching, you'll hear in a second, but Dan was at the school in Air Force One, made the 2 stops later that afternoon, and then eventually back to DC. But just talk us through the morning and what happened to the events that led up, around 8:45 that day.
Yeah, so it was a typical day. There was, so we're 9 months into the presidency of a first-term president, very similar situation to where Joe Biden, the current president, finds himself facing now, probably the first bit of adversity, in the sense that, there's a lot of commentary around President Bush's agenda stalling, particularly around education reform, which he was pushing at the time. So we were traveling that day in Florida to talk about and highlight the president's reform package around education. And so that morning he was to do the school visit. And it was like any typical day of travel. President Bush was a pretty disciplined person when it comes to exercise. He had gotten up earlier that morning and went and jogged, as did I, not with him, but and I remember, it was about 8:48 a.m. We're pulling up to the elementary school. Several of us were getting calls from the White House saying, hey, we just kind of flagged this for you in case the media asks, and you may want to let the president know, but there's been some sort of plane accident in New York where a plane has hit one of the World Trade Center towers. And similar to everybody else, including the president, who himself is a trained pilot, thought that is, either a weather-related event, or, some sort of, did the pilot have a heart attack or some sort of medical event that had caused such a egregious error, because it felt like, we didn't know it was a commercial airliner at that point. We just thought it was a personal aircraft. So a lot of puzzlement around that, but it wasn't one in which we thought anything other than just that, an accident. It wasn't until we got into so we felt like with that in mind, we thought, there's no reason for us to disrupt our program or the president's schedule at that point. And so we proceeded with that. And so the president then, as it was, recorded in history and famously referenced, was he was sitting in the classroom. And it's really an extraordinary moment to think that one of the last people to know what was happening in the country was the president of the United States. And we were debating outside that room, is like, we've got to do something. And that's when we decided that the president's chief of staff, Andy Card, would go in and tell him that the second tower, that a plane had hit the second tower, that America was under attack. That then became a moment for President Bush to decide what to do. And I think at that time, he felt like in times of leadership, you have to show a steady hand. And the last thing we wanted was some sort of panicky move. And so it was his judgment to let that program for a few minutes finish before he left, as opposed to bolting out of there. I know there's been a lot of armchair quarterback, whether that was the right thing or not. It didn't change anything about the decision-making or what had to transpire. So we quickly, after that, huddled the president in the holding room. And anytime the president travels, he has a room that has secure lines for him to talk to anybody that he needs to talk to. In this case, it was the vice president. And at the same time, the FBI director, who was on his second day on the job. Bob Mueller was the FBI director. Can you imagine the second day on a job that you have to deal with the most an unprecedented attack on our territory. And so at this point, you have a lot of what they call the fog of war, a lot of information flowing in. We didn't have a firm grasp, but we knew that we made a very short remarks there. So I'm there help preparing President Bush to make remarks. Very difficult to do, not knowing where we were in this attack, how many more elements to it or stages to that attack there might be. But the plan was to, as quickly as possible, is to get to Air Force One. And at that time, we presumed that we were heading back to Washington, D.C. That turned out not to be the case.
So when this all happened, I'm sure we all remember that we're watching the president holding his composure. You could tell he was a bit biting his lip, trying to figure out what to do. And then you're all huddled over in the sides and up to sure outside the room, trying to make decisions. When you got regrouped, you got back to Air Force One. What happened that changed then the decision to go from DC to instead turning to Louisiana?
Interesting enough, and just these little things that, not there at the time. We, anytime you travel with the president, you're in the big motorcade, all those different things, and they travel pretty swiftly. I remember getting in that motorcade to the Air Force Base where the Air Force One was, and we were probably going 100 miles per hour. It was faster than ever, and they had a whole cocoon of police cars and other things around in case there was some sort of car bomb. When you start seeing what the Secret Service does when they're in emergency mode, it was quite extraordinary. And then when we got to the airport itself, and there was, the pilots and others said that there was some unidentified vehicle at the end of the runway on the opposite side. So they got permission to take off opposite direction and use diversionary tactics. When I tell you, this is not like when you board American Airlines or Southwest Airlines, where they wait till everybody gets seated. When you're typically on Air Force One, people are walking around while we're taxiing and taking off. And I do remember, and usually we take off with a pretty decent ascent, but nothing out of the ordinary. That plane took off like a rocket. And I distinctly remember like literally holding on to a chair so I wouldn't fall over because of the diversionary tactics they were taking out of precaution. And it was about that time really when we were taking off that the Pentagon got hit. And so this notion that we were going to go back to Washington, D.C. was changing by the minute, by the second. And the decision then was to regroup, to head west and regroup at Barksdale Air Force Base in Texarkana, Texas. And so we started to head that way. And again, like I said, interesting enough, and one of the difficult things in a period like this is that you try to divorce the personal from the professional, which is very difficult to do. For the president himself, he has family. The First Lady Bush, Laura Bush, was at the Capitol for an event that day, the U.S. Capitol. Former President Bush, his parents were traveling as well. I think they were in Milwaukee that day. So you're trying to, he has his daughters also. And so he's trying to, my family, okay. And we're all doing the same thing. And you got to remember, this is before iPhones and all that. I mean, the most, kind of cutting edge technology at that point was a BlackBerry. For those of you who are a little bit older might remember. And we had one person in the traveling party, Carl Rove, who had a BlackBerry. And I remember all of us getting in line and sending our wives, our spouses, notes with that BlackBerry saying, I'm okay. I'll talk to you when I can. It turned out the next time I talked to my wife was about 4:00 that morning. And so the day went on as we traveled to Barksdale Air Force Base, again, there to try to assess, at this point, we don't know how many commercial airliners are now literally being turned into missiles and into weapons. And so the FAA and the Department of Transportation working to try to ground all the commercial aircraft that are in the air. And we're talking about thousands of planes, many of those kind of particularly international flights coming in with no knowledge of really what the extent or how many waves of attacks we were to expect. But at the same time, what was gnawing on all of us was, from a leadership standpoint, we didn't want the president to be viewed as, quote unquote, on the run. But there's an obligation to the institution of the presidency and succession and the protecting of the presidency. And so you have this tension between the Secret Service and those who are not just protecting a person, but they're protecting the office of the president. And they don't really care about the politics of optics of what the president's doing. That's not their job. Their job is to protect the presidency. And so there was a lot of back and forth with the chief of staff, the president, and the security and also intelligence community back in Washington, D.C. about what we knew or didn't know. And so, again, there was this decision to wait. We decided then to relocate to what is called Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, which had a better command system there. It is actually the Air Force Base in which we help monitor the nuclear capabilities, not only of the United States, but around the whole world. So when you think about DEFCON 3, DEFCON 4, those things of other countries, that's where we're tracking it. It's where an old Cold War relic, the Doomsday Plane, as they called it, is situated there in case there is a Cold War, a nuclear attack on Washington, D.C. And so you're looking at all these things, and it literally feels like you're now inserting yourself into a movie script. It was a surreal experience and very difficult to clear your mind. And that's one thing it's one thing to train for crises. And I think we all know that. We do that in stores. We do that and we know, like, typical, right, like if there's a hurricane or if there's a active shooter in our stores, we kind of know what the playbook is and we can train our associates to that playbook. This was unprecedented. There wasn't really a playbook for all of us to follow. And at the same time, there was a lot of incomplete, or if not just completely wrong information, which made it very difficult in a time of crisis to make good decisions.
And Dan, I thinking about everything you just said, was it in the motorcade driving to Air Force One when you knew your job, your life, this experience was about to change pretty dramatically?
It was probably in the holding room in the school and there's a picture that was captured publicly or released publicly. And because you got to remember, we didn't, information, the best information we really were getting were from the news networks. Yeah, and right. There's a picture of President Bush is on the phone and he's speaking, I think, to the vice president, and I'm pointing at the screen watching the first tower fall. And just total disbelief like others. And so your mind's not really processing, kind of the longer term ramifications. It was probably when we started to make that trip back to Washington, D.C. from Offutt Air Force Base, the president was going to return. We're starting to work on the speech that he was going to deliver to the nation. And the president started talking about what was going to be necessary in the days and weeks ahead. You start kind of really wrapping your head around that this has fundamentally changed the nature of the job. A job that, again, we were just kind of starting to get our arms around, having only been 9 months into the presidency and knowing that the presidency for this president had fundamentally changed. And what was really interesting to watch with him and was, how do you check your emotions and keep your emotions at bay. And he had a range of those emotions of sadness and sorrow for those who lost life. And there were people, and we learned while we were on Air Force One that at the time, the Solicitor General for the United States, Ted Olson, his wife, Barbara Olson, was on Flight 77 that ultimately hit the Pentagon. It really struck home that here was somebody that we knew personally who was part of this horrific event. And then anger. The president really had to check that emotion as well to really want, obviously, retribution. But these are emotions that when you're the leader of the free world and you have to be able to present yourself in a way that brings confidence and reassurance, you got to know how to check those emotions and not wear them as much on your sleeve. And in some cases, it's appropriate to wear them on your sleeve, but finding that rhythm, and that was a difficult period for him on that day and a couple of days after, to find that right rhythm of emotion and tapping into where the country was and where they wanted to go. And every president kind of has to find their footing during a crisis like that. And that doesn't happen instantly, and particularly with something of such enormity as 9/11. And so, I think it was probably later in that week where he really did find his footing. But as I look back on it, and again, I tell you, it's like a movie script almost. Probably one of the most memorable, etched in my memory moments was as we were flying back into Washington, D.C. airspace. We have 2 fighter jets just off the tips of both wings of Air Force One. And the nation's capital was deserted. It was empty, except for emergency personnel. You could see military and first responder personnel. And then you see smoke billowing out of one of the most mighty buildings in the country, the Pentagon. And you just watch it. We watched it in disbelief that it actually happened. And we landed at Andrews Air Force Base. We get on the helicopters to go, and we're flying over the DC terrain there and city, and fear takes over. Again, we don't know. This is a sophisticated attack. We don't know if there were people, hidden with RPGs and are going to take out the president's helicopters. That's another emotion that was real. It's one that you didn't really want to accept or acknowledge, but all of us felt it.
And throughout the day, there were levels of reality hitting, I'm sure. And the other end of the range of motion of the day, there were people all over the country that were living through, different sorts of fear, uncertainty, and something you said about leadership, trying to figure out how to do the role you've been assigned at a time when emotions are starting hitting. I remember about the time you were talking about the first tower falling. I was running a Walmart store in Jacksonville, North Carolina, and I thought that was the point I need to pull my department managers together to tell them what had happened. And as you said, people in the stores, we didn't have BlackBerries. None of us really had even cell phones at that time. So there wasn't any communication going on unless someone had physically called the store and told someone that it was happening. So I pulled 26 department managers together, and it hit me at that moment. I was telling them what had happened, and most of them were the spouse of a Marine, because we're about a mile north of what, as many of you know, is Camp Lejeune, where at that time there were 67,000 Marines. And I just remember looking at them, sort of explaining, thinking their spouse is about to go to war. And within a couple hours, the base was closing. Everybody left other than, I think, me and 4 or 5 associates who kept the store open for a few hours. But it was the look on their face when the emotion hits. And I remember thinking, I've got to stay composed, and I've got to be the leader that communicates this well so that they can have something stable in their lives so they can get back to the base. But I'm sure across the country, people watching, if you weren't born then, then, you could think about what this is like, but so many people are going to remember in the next couple of days what they're going through at that time. But I couldn't imagine what you and the team all the things you had to think through that day. So as you wrap up in Nebraska, I'm sure there were forces saying to the president, you can't go, and others saying we're going back to DC. How did that conversation run? And when you got there, how did it come together?
Yeah, it was, if the Secret Service had completely had its way, the president would have spent the night in Offutt Air Force Base. There was some growing criticism on television of the TV pundits and all saying, "Where's the president? Where's the president?" He just finally said, "We're going back." And I think at that time, while there was still a fear of by the intelligence community thought there was going to be another wave or an additional wave of attack, the president was just absolutely adamant that Air Force One was going back and he was going to be on it. And so that was kind of settled, and that we needed to address the nation, and we weren't going to address the nation from a military bunker in Nebraska. You can only imagine. So there are times when you have to make decisions like that. He made that decision, and it turned out to be the right one. Ultimately got back to the White House to deliver that speech that he delivered from the Oval Office. And again, you're trying at that point to balance, there's what's beginning as the recovery efforts in Lower Manhattan at the World Trade Center. There's also the rescue efforts and recovery efforts happening at the Pentagon, as well as the wreckage of Flight 93 in Pennsylvania, which was likely a plane that was headed to hit the U.S. Capitol or potentially the White House. And which was interesting is the president aptly at that time said the first counterattack in the war on terror started with the citizens on Flight 93, and which is just an extraordinary, moment for our country to see the courage of ordinary citizens stepping up and doing something extraordinary and selfless to save, I don't know, countless lives. The other interesting thing about that a lot of people don't know is that we knew that plane had been hijacked, and the president and vice president, the president communicated vice president about, unfortunately, the situation you never want to be in, which was authorize our own military jets to take down that plane before it could do greater harm. The interesting thing about that story is that the two fighter jets, they were National Guard fighter jets, scrambled from Washington, D.C. They had to scramble so quickly that they didn't even have time to arm the planes. So they had no ammunition. So as those two pilots took off, and one was a female pilot and a male pilot, they knew that they were going to have to collide with and take the plane out. And they talked about one was going to hit the front of the plane and the other one was going to hit the back of the plane. Could you imagine having that mission of not only giving yourself up, but then having to kill fellow Americans to save a greater number of Americans? Luckily, those citizens on the plane took matters into their own hands and ultimately didn't have to make that call. But I can just imagine the president having to make that decision, but also those two pilots would have to execute that decision.
Yeah, it's a true example of putting cause and country above yourself. And I remember that day there were a few people on 93 that had called family, and one was Todd Beamer. The story of what Todd did, and I think obviously made famous at the time when he says, "Let's roll and let's go to the cockpit." How did you guys hear about that story? When did you know about it? Was it later in the week?
Yeah, it was. I can't remember exactly which day it was later. The president did have the opportunity to meet with Todd Beamer's wife and family, as he did with many of the families from that flight, and he really just in complete awe of their courage, and that is the one thing about the communications. They were able to learn, and through them reaching out to family to say, "Hey, I think our plane's been hijacked," that right. Family members were able to inform that it's like, "Hey, this is two plane." They didn't know that the planes had hit the two towers, so now they were able to get information, and that critical. If you think about it, it really was the first military operation in the U.S. response to a terrorist attack. Intelligence being given to the front line and them acting on it like Todd Beamer did. They knew, okay, we know what they want to do with this plane. There's a target of civilians they want to take out. Let's roll. Just extraordinary. And I remember attending the ceremony we did in that field in Pennsylvania, where we now have a monument recognizing their heroism. Just extraordinary. Yeah,
it was. I distinctly remember when the plane went down, someone recorded Vice President Cheney stating that was an act of heroism. And then as a Walmart associate, probably a year or two later, I don't remember the time exactly, we also had the chance to hear from Lisa Beamer. She came and spoke to all of us at one of our fall or year beginning meetings. And it's one of those events, moments that in my career I'll never forget. And it's a true privilege of getting to hear from someone like that. And it's the advantage of being a Walmart associate, and pretty amazing experience overall. So, Dan, the events of 2001 and beyond, fast forward now to 2020, we are trying to manage a retail business. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. I remember the day that you and I met in the hallway when the World Health Organization determined that coronavirus was a pandemic, a global pandemic. How did those experiences then help prepare you for what we've been through in the last year? Because I can tell everyone on here, despite what was going on, there was always one calm voice in the room, and that was Dan. And I kept thinking, why does he keep staying so calm? And then, it hit me, well, compared to everything you've been through, this was probably like a Thursday in the office in Washington, D.C. in October of 2001.
Yeah, sometimes I worry that maybe my sensories have been dulled a little bit too much. I mean, if you think about my time in government, we dealt with not only obviously 9/11 and then the aftermath of Iraq and Afghanistan, a shuttle disaster, 2 Supreme Court nominations, Katrina, financial crisis, which I wasn't in the White House for that time in 2008. I'd already left, but helped to deal with it from the outside. So these experiences I had going through all these different crises, whether it be 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan, the crisis around Katrina and those things. One thing about 9/11 is we quickly realized that this was unprecedented. This wasn't a typical crisis that we had a playbook for. And frankly, that's the same thing with the pandemic. None of us, this is a 100-year event. And so as a leadership team, we have to sit down and say, okay, let's start with the principles. What are the principles we're going to use to make decisions? And as you set out those principles, that then becomes the guiding force for you as you make decisions about what are the protocols we're going to put in place for the safety of our associates, the safety of our customers. And then as we've come to know, there's an expectation in not only just in the market here in the United States, but elsewhere of, Walmart can contribute mightily during times as we can use our scale for good. So we quickly start thinking about how can we contribute to help solve this problem? And obviously that started with setting up testing centers and those things, then morphs into how we can be a deployer of the vaccines themselves and educate the public about taking vaccines and those things. And so it's been a no more trying experience than for our frontline associates. But I think having those true principles, leaning on the values of the company, our core values, those are kind of the things that guide us through a period like this. And then you can't be rigid. You can't think the answers to everything. And that's one thing I've learned through my experiences is that, boy, the first thing you have to be is open to alternative points of view, open to alternative ways of doing things, because I think those who fail in those periods, because they become stuck and rigid, thinking they know the answers to things. And I think as a leadership team, we really were open and agile when it came to those moments of decisions.
Yeah, I totally agree. And and one of the things that people could take from what you just said, and the lessons are when you're in situations that are unusual, different, we haven't experienced before, rely on others, ask for advice, ask for contrary points of view. Don't assume any of us know, because as you said, the last one of these was 100 years ago, and it may be another 100 years. And there is no guide or playbook on how you manage a retailer or a country through a global pandemic at a time when there's so much technology and information moving. There's some of it's right, some of it's wrong, but principles are important. I really distinctly remember when we sat on a call one day and said, we've got to think about what are the principles by which we're going to operate. And at the top of the list was associate safety, customer safety, serving communities. And there are a few things under that, but those were always the top 3. And those principles really helped. Something I did learn in the last few years that I've heard for many years, but and many times when the pressure's on, it's usually not as bad as you think. It's not as good as you think. And trying to stay somewhere in the middle and stay grounded and rely on facts and information, and trying to keep emotions down, which leads to, in times of crisis, you got to sleep, you've got to eat, you've got to rest, you've got to stay in a position where you don't become fatigued and let emotions come over. So the last question is, through the time of 20 years ago and last year, how do you stay balanced and make sure that you're rested, you're thinking clearly? Because, any of us in any of our jobs, whether you're a cashier or a store manager or working in a fulfillment center, there's enough work to go on 168 hours a week. That's always been that way and always will be the way. But how do you?
I mean, my wife, when I was working in the White House, they'd said, this is not a job, it's a way of life, because it followed us. I had literally a secure phone underneath my bed that they wired so I could take calls in the middle of the night. And as we felt about that is, in the average stay for a senior staffer in the White House is a little over 2 years. I ended up doing it for 7 and had 3 children while I was in the White House. It was kind of a hectic moment. So you do have to, and I give the credit to President Bush at that time, is like really setting priorities around, and to him, he called it the 3 F's in his life: faith, family, and friends. Those were kind of the places where he got his energy from, and we protected those things, and his ability to get exercise consistently, get the proper amount of sleep, those things. And to really think about it, that this was going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And we all know working at Walmart, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so we have to have boundaries. I know that's one thing for those of us who are working remotely, that's tough to do, the boundaries between the personal and the professional, but you got to create those boundaries and protect them. We've got to have, these values of respecting the individual and these things. We have to respect each other, particularly during times of stressful moments like we find ourselves in with the pandemic and whatnot. And as we dealt with like the social unrest of this past, 18 months and those things, a lot of our stores and clubs were at, right on the cusp of where a lot of that disruption was. And so leaning on each other, focusing on our own health, focusing on our personal health, as well as our relationships. Those are all very important to be, and you got to bring your full self to work, and you got to feel comfortable doing that. And as a company, we're trying to get better at making sure that people do feel comfortable bringing their full self to work. And so,
yeah, that's the thing about development and in running a business. When you think you've hit the destination, it just moved ahead a few more miles. So you got to get rest to keep it running. I remember last year we were all on about the 6 week straight of trying to manage, figure out what to do. And I think it was you I called and I said, I think I've got a way. I figured out how my team can take a half day or day off, and we're all going to cover for each other. And I think you started laughing and said, good luck. And
yeah.
It was a few weeks after that I realized I understand that one day that we decided we would all take ended up being about a half day. And then, later in the summer, things normalized a bit. But for a couple months there, it was taking information, react as fast as you can, figure out how to source masks for associates before that deadline was coming. And, we know a lot more now and we're more equipped. But, for everybody that's watching, there's a lot in the stories that Dan's talked about, a lot in the lessons, and we're in this as a team, and we rely on each other. And what those principles you said of faith, family, friends, what you didn't hear in there was self. It's not all up to any of us to try to come up with all the answers ourselves or do everything ourselves. We've got a great team of people who can support us, and somewhere in the group, in any facility, there's probably a person who can help any of us think through what might be next and how to manage, and just rely on people that have different experiences. That's the value of diversity and diverse thought and diverse backgrounds all coming together, trying to achieve a single mission.
Yeah, I agree. And one final point I would make that I've learned during times like this is, don't assume somebody else has thought of what to do. Don't assume that there's people above you that's figured it out. If you got an idea, share it. You'd be surprised how many times that it becomes the kernel of something that turns into a major policy change. I've seen it at government. I've seen it here at Walmart. So we don't know unless you assert yourself. So don't assume somebody else is going to come up with that idea. Be the person who comes up with that idea that helps improve the company, helps each other. And if it turns out to be one that we already thought of, no harm done.
Right.
It could be that big one that changes the direction of really important policies that could impact literally thousands, if not millions of people.
Yeah, that's right. Because so many things we've done in the last couple of years have been emails from associates, an idea of when we went in a facility, in a store, or to some sort of communication, or ask Sam. There are great ideas coming in all the time. Well, Dan, thanks so much for the time. And for associates that want to participate in anything more broadly, there are things you can do. You can contribute at things like the roundup at walmart.com. That's a featured nonprofit for the 9/11 Memorial Museum, and then the Never Forget Fund. And anytime you have a chance to, if there's a way to either go see the memorial in New York or tour the Pentagon and hear the stories of what happened that day, just a great way to really pay some sort of tribute to those who lost their lives on 9/11 and the families and the survivors still today. This is an event that changed the country, and it's timely that we get to talk about this today as we head to the 20th anniversary of the attack. Dan, thanks a lot. Thanks for your contributions as an associate, and thanks for your contributions as an American government.
You bet. Pleasure.